Hello and welcome to this month's Practice as Research seminar. And it's amazing how quick time goes. And we are already on the 6th session in year 5 of the Practice as Research seminar series. We have got today with us Olivia Maurer, who's going to be talking to us about the theatre of the oppressed. Again, as I've said so many times in these seminars, I was lucky enough to see Olivia present at a conference, the International Creative Research Methods Conference in Manchester. And having seen what she's done there, I was quite keen to get her onto this seminar series. So I approached her and she's kindly agreed to be with us today. So Olivia is a postgraduate researcher in urban studies and social policy at the University of Glasgow, with a background in public policy and arts-based community engagement. Her PhD works in partnership with the AHRC place-based research programme to build an evidence base of methodologies that are able to surface the felt experience of place, specifically focused on using the theatre of the oppressed as both a research method and a policy engagement tool. Olivia is also a community theatre practitioner, with her work recently being showcased at the UK Parliament as one of 100 creative agents of climate change. And unfortunately, you're not as lucky as I was, because when I was at that conference, Olivia did some practicals with us. So we did get to do some embodied experiences and some scenes and improvisations. Obviously, in this kind of space, that's not quite so possible. But I'm going to hand over to Olivia, and yeah, please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, Nicole. I should have put our slides in from that to show everyone the images. Thank you again so much for having me. I'll be talking today about the use of theatre of the oppressed in my practice-based research, as well as my kind of journey into doing practice-based research and what that looks like in this kind of social science context and the way I kind of discovered it. So first, we'll be talking about myself, background of the project, then kind of some reflections on the artist-researcher relationship and how those influence each other, and I've learned from each part of those. Then I'll talk about my work using practice-based research, and then the value that I see of doing practice-based research within a social science context in my discipline in urban studies. So great. So as Nicole said, my name's Olivia. I'm a third-year postgraduate researcher at the University of Glasgow within the Division of Urban Studies and Social Policy. My academic background is in policy, but I've also done work with arts-based community engagement. And I also have an activist artist practice using theatre of the oppressed. But this is something that is still quite new to me. And I think when I started the PhD, I probably wouldn't have called myself an artist. So that's kind of been a journey as I've been developing my research practice as well. And I think they're really related, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now. So the beginning of my PhD really began with a methodological question. So what type of research method is something that would work to surface a felt experience of place? So when I say felt experience of place, it's thinking about the emotional attachments to place, the kind of everyday experiences that we have in the built environment in urban centers, but kind of any place that you inhabit in everyday experience. So how do we understand that? How do we research that? Because it's so ephemeral and individual. So what process would work for that? So I set out to use theatre of the oppressed as that research method, but I didn't know if it was going to work. It was kind of exploratory research. So seeing, we'll give this a go, see if this is a method that works, but it is very practice-based. So I think when I started, I didn't know it was practice as research, but it was the process of doing and learning through doing, which then I realized is what practice as research is, but kind of stumbled upon it from that methodological question. So as I mentioned before, the kind of artist practice that came along with this. So as I started to do the PhD and do this work studying theatre of the oppressed and learning how I could use it in this research context, I felt like maybe I was skipping a step, that maybe I needed to understand it practically as an art form first before I had to adapt into this context. It felt like, how can I adapt something that I've never done as an art practice? Am I the best person to do that then? And I was also really enjoying learning about the method and all the different ways it had been used. And I was like, this seems so fun and interesting as well. So as I was kind of in my first year of the PhD, doing a literature review, I was like, we need to have a bit more practice, a bit more movement here. So I became part of a mentorship young artist development program with the organization In Place of War, which is a UK organization, but it works globally with artists in conflict, but also a bit more about climate change as well. In that process, I had a mentor and had seed funding and lots of support and education to kind of try something new and get a chance to do this theatre practice in an art activist space. It was really transformative for me personally in many ways, but I think it also helped me better prepare for the research process because it was getting to do this practice kind of without the limitations and the structure of the research environment. So here's a couple of photographs from this. So on the left-hand side is a workshop in Glasgow about using theatre of the oppressed and forum theatre specifically to work through experiences of climate anxiety and kind of brainstorm collective action and using the method. And then on the right is a picture from a part of a residency that we had done and the event in Parliament where we got to talk to climate ministers and kind of talk about the findings and the art experience from communities. So this opportunity to use the method outside of the research context, I felt was quite freeing. There was less pressure to have a certain outcome, which obviously, doing exploratory research, you still should not feel that pressure, but I think you still kind of still have a bit of a hope that it turns out the way that you would like it to. So getting to do it here felt really intuitive and flexible. And I think now kind of having this dual identity as a researcher and an artist, I think it's helped me understand both of them better because I understand maybe what they're not by knowing the other identity. So it's been really, really helpful. Something I've kind of noticed, I felt quite interesting with kind of working within a university setting, kind of the difference around ethics and how we kind of view participants' agency. I think sometimes you're going through like a university ethics process. There's like a lot of talk about ownership over things, and sometimes people can feel like it's quite patronizing to participants that you work with. And so you have quite a duty of care, but sometimes it doesn't really let people express themselves or kind of have ownership over their work. And I thought that was quite interesting to contrast with kind of an artistic desire to like provoke emotion and elicit reactions and reflections that can sometimes be a bit challenging. And that's the point of that type of art. And how do you kind of balance those frameworks? Something I'm thinking a lot about, especially moving this work forward. But I find that quite an interesting comparison. But I think they've helped me kind of understand each area better and how they also overlap and can support one another when you're doing this type of practice-based research, how much artists can learn from researchers and researchers can learn from artists. So kind of back to a bit more of the research focus, I talked about the beginning of my PhD came from this methodological challenge of researching the felt experience of place. So that as a concept pulls from multidisciplinary traditions within urban studies, sociology, anthropology. We kind of define it as the way that we feel in and about places and the felt relationships we have to and within place. So it's quite broad, there's quite open-ended, there's so much you could do there. The way that I approach that is foregrounding the body as the prism through which we look at experience. So there's so many forms of silos that look at these types of things, people that look at place attachment, atmosphere, sensory experiences. There's such a range of disciplines there. The way I kind of bring them together is the body is the way that we experience all of these things. So looking at methods then that are embodied and sensitive to emotions. So yeah, this methodological epistemological question of how do we study this is what led me to the theatre of the oppressed, which I've been talking about for a while, but not defining. So I'm going to do that right now. So theatre of the oppressed is a practice developed by Augusto Boal in the 70s in Brazil. It's a form of participatory interactive activities. They create space for both critical discourse and promote community activism for political and social change. It has an international community of practitioners. It is also quite commonly used in lots of educational research because it's based on the pedagogy of the oppressed by Paulo Freire. So there's lots of overlap there in educational research communities, as well as like political and community organizing. I thought it was a really good fit for this methodological question because it creates space for active embodied reflection. So it's kind of an active embodied form of the pedagogy of the oppressed. A lot of these underlying theoretical frameworks are the same. And I think it's also a well-suited method for understanding emotion and sensory experiences because it privileges the physical expression over the verbal. So sometimes these are experiences that people don't know how to verbally express, or it's not something that you spend time thinking about. Your attachment to the way you walk into work every day, that's not something people spend time to think about. But when you're having this physical reflective space, it can be a way of disrupting those kind of normative hierarchies of data, knowledge production, as well as seeing them as being valuable forms of knowledge. The way that my kind of work using theatre of the oppressed differs from a lot of pre-existing research is a lot of that is very focused towards a specific issue in a community, a specific experience of oppression. This was a bit more open-ended. So instead of going in a community and organization about a very specific topic, I wanted to see what would happen if we have a spatial focus rather than an issue focus. It was kind of a proof of concept, case study, explorative. But again, it was very explorative, very practice-based. Wasn't sure what was going to come out of it. So I was like, we'll try it with this. But if I'm not focused on a specific issue of oppression and we're using theatre of the oppressed, it may not work. This may not be the good framing. So it was quite interesting to see what came out of it. So the overall research aim of my PhD is exploring if the method is able to surface that felt experience of place, but also communicate that in a way that can facilitate more place-sensitive policy. So I have a second half of my research that's looking at policy engagement in the UK with theatre of the oppressed. I'm not getting into that today because that's a whole other chapter, but it's looking at it as a research method, but also a policy engagement tool. But today I'm just talking about 3 workshops that I conducted in Glasgow using image theatre, which is kind of fundamental building block of all forms of theatre of the oppressed. It's often done without an audience, so it's a more workshop environment, more similar to like a focus group rather than a performance. So it's about the participants and it's as a group rather than something that's performative. But the other forms, like legislative theatre and forum theatre, have more audiences. But again, this is a very targeted one, but I'll get into that in later parts of my research. And the analysis process of the workshop is really interesting. So it was co-analyzing the images within the workshop. And I'll talk about that after I show a couple of images first, because I know everyone's probably wanting to see a visualization of what it is that I'm talking about. So here's some highlights from the workshop. If anyone's familiar with Glasgow, one of the big images that is in every postcard is the statue of the Duke of Wellington on a horse that has a traffic cone on his head. So the middle one is them creating that as the most popular image. Every workshop, I probably have like 8 different versions of that as being quite like a symbol of Glasgow that people wanted to portray. And then you can also see a range of different emotions, expressions, and you can see that people worked individually in making images, worked in partners, worked in groups. So it kind of developed as being not a solo process, but a collaborative one in which people were inspired and learned from one another. Here's a couple more images of kind of the range of expression and movement that happened in the workshop. The one in the middle is a pigeon as well, which is very urban studies. I don't know if people could tell it's a pigeon, but very, very much I mean that vein of like industrial British cities. But um, yeah, so the co-analysis process was something going into the workshops that I wasn't exactly sure how we would analyze it because it was going to be a lot going on, how to capture everything that was happening through recording and making sure I wasn't missing moments, and how do we understand what it is that was happening. But then I eventually realized that the only real way would be co-analyzing participants, especially because with images, they can be so subjective and personal as well. So they had multiple examples where people were making images and they meant something totally different to other people in the workshop, but then they would use the image in a way that they saw it. So these images kind of were being replicated with different meanings. And then they would kind of spur reflections in really interesting ways. And it would also kind of show some of their assumptions around the place that we were talking about. And then, even though there's something I wasn't sure about, it actually gets us closer to the ethos of pedagogy of the oppressed. So I should have known it from the beginning, but I feel like I had to kind of learn through doing that this process is most representative of the research process. So a lot of about co-learning and collaborative knowledge production. Yeah, and again, it seems like quite an obvious path, but I think kind of doing this work within a more like traditional social science format and framing, I think I have like an internal positivist that's within me being like, oh, is that really a rigorous form? And you know, I'm kind of fighting with that. Cop in the head is a phrase Boal uses a lot about kind of the way we internalize external oppressions and structures. How even though no one's asking you to do something a certain way, you have this kind of internal version that's going to keep you on this path. So I think still working through kind of ignoring some of those voices and doing what's most representative of the research process. Something I wanted to share again was about the richness of the findings through doing this work. So we had a range of emotional experiences in place: joy, fear, anxiety, smugness, hope, overwhelmed, pride, disgruntled, contentment. So it wasn't just the highs and the lows. I think also when we do research into emotional experiences, it can often kind of forget the more mundane everyday experiences. So I was quite happy to see that it kind of has a range of different experiences. It also surfaced loads of other aspects around the felt experience of place. So it's not just emotions, but people were talking about kind of superstitions in the areas that they lived, and like local traditions and local figures that people would see walking around that they all kind of knew and had a sense of. There's kind of like public concepts. There's also a lot of talk about like memories that happen in this location, or aspirations that would happen in this place for these places. There's talk about pollution and kind of sensory experiences around smog and being in the city. And then again, attachments to big landmarks in the built environment, and pride in architecture. Also like common behaviors and rituals they do, why these places are meaningful to them. A reflection of a sense of belonging, or kind of a sense of change. People who were getting ready to move away from Glasgow feeling a sense of belonging might not be there anymore when they're not here, and kind of grappling with those experiences. And then also the impact of the built environment on their presentation itself. So talking about how certain designs might make them feel like they have to be a bit more conformist in the way they present themselves and their attitudes in place, which is, again, something I feel like would never come up in a questionnaire or a focus group. There's like really like minute detail and experiences that often people wouldn't think to reflect on because they've ever been asked to. So really, really rich what came out of this. And I think that was also because it was so open-ended and it allowed people to express so many things. And I didn't have a really, really specific outcome of what I was wanting to get out of this. It was just seeing what would happen if we gave it a go. So something else about the method, participants talked at the end. We had like a reflection in the last bit of the workshop where people talked about how it helped them reflect on things that they don't think about in their daily lives. They felt that it helped them learn more about themselves and what they feel about the place that they live in. And it also helped them challenge some stereotypes around the places. So as like we went through the workshop, one participant kind of was relying on stereotypes of types of people that live in this neighborhood and things like that, and kind of like comedic stereotypes of place. But then as he went further on in the workshop, he was like, I don't think I actually believe that. Like, it's what people have told me this place is like, but from my experience of living here, it's very different, and it has this much more diverse experience. So like, that kind of process of doing in the workshop kind of brought up some nuanced reflections and was a collaborative learning process. So I think it's really interesting to think about how it's an opportunity to co-produce knowledge. And that knowledge is about empowering people through new understanding, which kind of goes back to the pedagogy of the oppressed, where it's not knowledge for knowledge's sake, but it's a form of transformative knowledge that can help people change some circumstances, which kind of leads down a route of more participatory action research, which Theatre of the Oppressed is kind of more aligned to. This again was quite a small case study of seeing what's possible, so it didn't have that participatory angle, but it's kind of where I'm hoping to go with this in the future a bit more. So seeing how these are kind of the building blocks that could lead us towards that. Then I just want to talk a little bit about doing practices research within a PhD. And that it can feel quite scary, because I think imposter syndrome is really common among PGRs, but feeling like you're trying something, and you know, that experience is really, really common. But I think doing exploratory practices research can kind of heighten that, because you genuinely don't know what's going to happen, and you kind of feel like it's a shot in the dark sometimes. I think a lot of my PhD at the beginning felt like I was driving a plane while still building it, and that kind of process of just going along. And it's a really practical process. And you learn a lot through it, but it can feel a bit daunting. And I think, as I mentioned before, in kind of a more social science context, you're still kind of, even if it's not from the people around you, I think it's in your head, the kind of positive ideas of what is data and what's the purpose of your research, and trying to justify the rigor of artistic work and practice-based work. I'm in my third year now, so I'm writing up my thesis, and I'm still kind of trying to balance that within the document of trying to show like the unconventionality of the work and how so much of it has come up through a practice process and through learning, but also still trying to sound a bit more formal and not read like a diary entry of all my thoughts and reflections, and highlighting, the fundamentals of the research, and that I'm able to subvert them, but kind of balancing that formality and informality, which is kind of hard to do when it's, in this kind of ongoing process that is so about your journey and about your journey doing this process. And then I just want to talk about why I think the practices research is so needed, and within my discipline specifically. So these kind of questions around how do we study the things that we're interested in, they're epistemological challenges, and I think that requires new or uncommon ways of working. If we're interested in the ephemeral, we can't rely on kind of the traditional research methods that we're used to. And I think the body is such a crucial site of knowledge where I felt experience of place, and moving that work forward is moving towards an idea of epistemic justice and knowledge pluralism. So I think doing practice as research is so important, and is kind of the thing that we need to be prioritizing. Some of my provocations around this is, how can we do better to value other forms of knowledge that come from creative practice, practice research, embodied knowledge as a place, when it does kind of sit outside the standards of the discipline. And then also kind of getting back to my point about doing a practice-based research degree, how can we support PGRs and early career researchers to try things that might fail, especially in the kind of current status of the neoliberal university and higher education austerity? How can we support people to try things not knowing if they're going to succeed, because that is where you learn and where you grow, but how do you do that against research business case studies? I think it's important to think about. That's quite a dire end to it. I want to wrap up and that not be the end of it. But yeah, I've had a lovely time during my research. I've learned a lot, and yeah, it's been a great time. I've learned so much. Excited to have a bit of a discussion now. that's me, and that's my contact information if anyone wants to chat about this after today. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Olivia. Thank you. Really, really appreciate that. There's a virtual round of applause for you, as you can see on the screen. So there's a lot of love for you as well. Now, as I said to you before, sometimes the conversation takes a different route straight away. Sometimes I get to ask a question. As it happens, I don't get to ask my questions. I do have some. So I may have some time later, so I may fill in my questions later, but I do want to bring in Jade, who was the first to say, I've got a question for Olivia. So Jade, come on in.
Apologies, I also came a little late, so I missed the very beginning, but thank you so much. It's very exciting to hear about this and learn. I guess just a bit of context. So I'm a clinical psychologist working in the NHS, and kind of we're trying to develop more co-production and participatory action research elements of what we do. So we work with 18 to 25-year-olds who are marginalised youth. So I'm really excited to think about, would this be something that would work, and if so, how? So I think some of my questions are around the practicals, around some of it sounds like that idea of going in quite open around maybe an idea and seeing what comes of that. But I was also wondering, once you then had the idea and the experience of doing the theatre of the oppressed, what was then the methodology of asking the next bit and getting the reflections, getting the I guess the other bit of the data, so that there was one bit that was the doing of the theatre, if I'm understanding correctly, and then there was a bit which, what was the learning from that? What was their experience? What did the images mean? Was that like a focus group? How did you guys decide that together? How many times did you meet? Just a little bit more of the details around that would be super helpful for me. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for your question, Jade. So it was all kind of embedded in the initial theatre workshop process. So there wasn't a workshop and a separate focus group after. It was kind of an ongoing process. So we would do certain exercises, and people would create images. Then we would kind of check in, be like, what did that image mean to you? What did we kind of learn from that? So it was kind of an ongoing thing that we did throughout. And then at the end, talked a bit more broadly about, what did we learn? Were there aspects that were worked for people and didn't work for people? Did it change your understanding about anything? But I think it worked as a process throughout rather than being a follow-on session, which is something that I could think about in future workshops, because I would want to have longer processes with people over more periods of time. But these were kind of one-off individual groups and workshops with them.
And is that just sort of how theatre of the oppressed is? Is that like the model that's set up that way? Or is that a co-produced decision-making process with you and the participants who say, let's do it this way or let's do it that way?
So this one it's kind of an adapted version of how theatre of the oppressed works. So it was working with that structure, but adapting it for this context. So that wasn't as co-produced as it could have been, but throughout the workshop, there's often opportunities for to stop and discuss things and go back and try things as well. So trying to do it as we go rather than it being something that was, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think at this stage, it may be quite logical to bring in a different kind of question from a different person, which is kind of also about the process a little bit. And this is from Henriette, who's asking, well, she's saying many thanks for your presentation, first of all, and then she's asking, how did you choose your group? Do you think this could work in an inter or transdisciplinary context?
I'm trying to figure out which half of that to do first. I think it definitely could work in an interdisciplinary context. I think this is kind of it already, an interdisciplinary process, because I'm doing performance studies based work within a social science context. So I definitely think it's something that can work in loads of different disciplines. People are already using theatre of the oppressed in lots of different disciplines already to begin with. So I think it's definitely a possibility. For this specific one, this was done with groups of students at the University of Glasgow. So different student groups, some theatre students as well, which is a limitation of this type of data because it's people who maybe are a bit more comfortable doing this. But it was also because of the ethics involved and the non-anonymization of the process. because I needed to have photographs of everything, video recordings. Again, I didn't know what it would look like, so I needed to, be able to have documentation of it that was quite, I wouldn't say invasive, but I wanted to kind of do it with a group that was more comfortable doing that and wouldn't feel that that was a bit invasive. It's something that in future work I'm wanting to obviously expand on, because this was kind of like a test case study. And I knew I would be sharing images in loads of different ways. Want to make sure I wasn't putting anyone on the spot, making anyone feel uncomfortable. There might be versions, excuse me, versions of this where I don't have to share the images as widely, and that can stay like in a data repository or stay quite private, rather than being something that's distributed. If I'm working with groups that maybe that's not something that they're comfortable with. But since I knew I was going to have to show the method in so many places, wanted to make sure that everyone had really informed consent, was very comfortable with using that. But yeah, I think it definitely work in loads of contexts. And again, there are loads of practitioners around the world who are using theatre of the oppressed in loads of contexts. So definitely a possibility there.
I think, I mean, that was essentially one of my questions as well, is about, because you were talking about, like using people's bodies. And obviously I was there with a conference in Manchester where we did that. And I was wondering, a lot of people, when I do research methods training, they often ask me, how do I get people who may not want to do certain creative aspects of my research to get involved with that. And obviously when you're doing something embodied, I mean, many of us have got images of our own bodies that are so warped that we struggle with like making ourselves vulnerable in that kind of space. Did you find that you had that with some of your participants as well?
I think the comfort aspect. So a lot of the participants that I worked with were kind of part of pre-existing organizations. So they had a level of comfort with each other already, which I think helps, and is kind of what a lot of co-wild work suggests as well, as working with people who already have that relationship. So it's not that you're doing this in front of a room of strangers, it's people, you're doing it with members of your community. And so maybe you feel a bit less anxiety around doing that. But I've also, in the theatre of the oppressed or art context, outside of doing it in the research, worked with people who never did theatre in their life. It was not something that they were used to. Because the way you kind of introduce it is about like a form of play. So it's not performance, it's a form of like games and playing, and that kind of that people are more comfortable with than if you say like performance or theatre. People might get a bit scared. But if you think of it as playing, which is much more, looser context, I think people are more keen to do that. Than you might expect. I think we assume everyone's not going to be into it, but then people also don't get enough time to play in their lives. So when they get time to, people are a bit more keen to do it than you might think.
Thank you. So I've got another question. This one is from Giselle, who's also saying, many thanks for sharing. May I ask why you choose image theatre instead of other methods in theatre of the oppressed, like, for example, forum theatre?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So in my thesis overall, I do this first bit about image theatre, and then I do quite a bit about legislative theatre, and kind of completely skip over forum theatre, because I think it's so well studied already in so many contexts. That's kind of the most common form that people are familiar with when you think of theatre of the oppressed. I, again, was more interested in this kind of exploratory use of the body as a method. And I think that is more prevalent in image theatre because it is less about words. So in forum, you're creating scenarios and you're doing skits, and it is much more verbally based, versus image theatre is more about the body and the shapes and the movements. The Well talks about using as images as being like a whole different form of language. So it's the language of images. And so I was really interested in exploring that. And there's aspects of that are incorporated to forum theatre, but forum is a much more talky form that I think is quite well covered. So I wanted to look at it and kind of the part that I think isn't getting enough attention.
An interesting addition here, the question from Karen, who's then sort of also saying about the methods, and she's asking how much training in the methods did you actually feel that you needed, or would you recommend others to have before being confident to actually do this?
Yeah, definitely. And that was kind of why I talked about the artist practice that I was working on as well outside of this. Because when I started, I was like, I don't know if I have the training in this that I feel like I would need. It's not as commonly offered as like courses at your university and participatory theater. It's not as common. So I thought, yeah, but while it does have like quite a number of books and writings that are really instructive that I felt was helpful. But again, it feels like weird to do like embodied practice from entirely reading from a book. So had that as a basis. And then there's a theatre company in Edinburgh that is focused on using theatre of the oppressed called Active Inquiry. They've been great. I've been partnering with them for a lot of my research. And so they would run like a couple intensive days trainings that I would go to kind of help me get a bit more practice in this. And one of those trainings was run by Julian Boal, who's the son of Augusto Boal, who is a practitioner based in Brazil, but does international trading. So I was able to learn from him as well. Only have a couple of days, but that was really instructive, inspiring. There's also a whole like community of practice as well in the UK. So kind of learning through conversations here and there with practitioners. So I felt like it's been very like piecemeal throughout. Yeah, so I think, but also I think it's some of it is like giving it a go as well. I think I could do a million trainings and still not feel 100% confident in it. But I think getting support from loads of people who have been doing it for decades has been really helping in my confidence.
Thank you very much. At this stage, could I bring in Ranjita, please? Ranjita has raised a question. Ranjita?
Hello. Hi, Nicole. Thank you very much, Olivia. My camera is very, very slow. It's warming up. I have to leave for teaching shortly, but thank you. I missed the first part of your talk, but I do creative global health. I use participatory and creative approaches, transdisciplinary work with communities, and the thing about data and outputs when you're using this multimodal approach, and just your kind of experience of how you're going to manage your data, your analysis plan, your decision on like the curation of your data and the analysis, because I'm sure that you probably had to design your own ways of the analysis plan. That's how, in the traditional way of like describing it. Just wanted your thoughts on it, of the management of data, if we can call it the management or curation of data, however you like to call it.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, like how to frame kind of the tiers of analysis and the process of it, because I have like a bit more transitional, like traditional coding of what we talked about towards the end of our workshops and the focus groups, but then we have all of the visual data and the videographic data as well. And so I'm working through the chapters around this. And so when I was discussing the findings, like talked about the discussion first and then talked about the visual data, the supervisors were like, we spent all this time talking about the images being the primary source of data, and here you privileged the written above it. I was like, I have done that. So it's still something that I'm kind of fighting against and trying to let different parts of data speak for themselves rather than feeling like, and that's something I'm still working through, because it is so much easier to kind of rely on the forms of data that you're more comfortable using, or, you know, people will have a more traditional response to. I'm not sure that is answering what you were asking there. But
yeah, no, thank you. It was just that when you are kind of working visually, sensorially, in an embodied way, I can imagine your space being covered with, not just in your computer, but it's the physical objects, what triggers and reminds you of things, and as part of the analysis process, and also the sights and smells and sounds of things, because you're kind of, there's a really kind of, you're engaging in all your senses in the analysis. It's in a very embodied way. So I'm really interested in what do people's workspaces look like when you're doing this type of work in the analysis, because I think we don't really hear much about that in the process. So
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
what I was wondering.
Yeah. But I'm trying to find ways of like I've incorporating some like video clips within the thesis document as well, because even I talked about actually I have videos of it, but I kind of only want paired to use the images was kind of my original plan. But then there's so much kind of like the sounds and the things like that, the kind of more sensorial parts that I feel like are so important in understanding parts of the workshop and why they're working. So trying to incorporate that in it as well is something that I'm yeah wanting to incorporate. But it is figuring out how to do it is really interesting.
Yeah, planning of it is a project in itself. But thank you so much. I have to go. I'll be looking at the rest of this recording, and thank you very much, Nicole and Oliver. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Olivia, there was a question from Rosario, which is kind of leading away a little bit from the methodology. Rosario is asking, "Hi Olivia, thank you so much for sharing. Really interesting. I would like to hear a bit more about the policy side of your research. If you could say a few words about that."
Yeah, definitely. It's something I find really interesting, and it's one of the reasons why I got interested in using theatre of the oppressed is because of the possibility of legislative theatre and that being a process that is able to blend theatre and policy, which are kind of my two interests that have come together in this. So legislative theatre is a format of theatre of the oppressed. It's not as widely practiced as forum, and there are loads of practitioners who aren't really they primarily do forum theatre, and legislative theatre is not really something that they're interested in. But it's kind of been growing in popularity a lot in the past years, especially in the UK. There's kind of been a bit of a boom in using legislative theatre. So I would suggest if you're interested in learning a bit more about it, Katie Rubin is kind of one of the key legislative theatre practitioners in the UK. There's a website called the People Act Legislative Theatre, and it has an interactive map that shows forms of legislative theatre that are being done internationally, and there are policy briefs in there as well for certain projects, so showing how legislative projects have been turned into policy briefs and have had engagement with policymakers. There are some projects that are like one day, one-off events, and there are some that have been happening for like 6 years. So there's a real range of different forms of using this. Something that I'm interested in that I'm working through is I was interviewing legislative theatre practitioners about how policymakers view their work and kind of view it as data and evidence, and what type of pushback you might get, or how you kind of got people on side to view it as valuable evidence and knowledge. So I'm kind of curious about that kind of bargaining period when you get people on side to your projects. But there's loads of different places where it's happening in the UK. Manchester's a really good example, and it informed a lot of their housing and homelessness strategy a couple of years ago. That's kind of a main key example, but it's used in so many different spaces. The project that I did observation on was with Historic Environment Scotland, so very urban studies related. It was about how to make their sites more accessible physically, financially, socio-economically as well. So loads of different options there, but I would recommend you looking at the People Act website because it has a wealth of really, really good information.
Thank you. So just to say, Rosario's also commented on, when you were talking about anonymizing some of the videos and the images and sort of struggling with that a little bit. Rosario suggests that there are ways to anonymize images, for example, turning an image into a line drawing. So in that respect, you can still just share it quite widely, and be able to show the bodily orientation and even the facial expressions, for example.
Yeah, and there were periods where I thought about doing that. When I was designing the research in my ethics about making it more of a possibility. But I do just feel a bit of an aversion of like separating people from their bodies and kind of pulling that from the site that came from. I know it's really good for anonymization, but they're also like, if you see there's some versions where it's like has like people's like eyes redacted, and I'm like, well, it kind of takes away all of the feeling if you kind of are redacting it. So it's not an easy solution. Maybe I'll think about that a bit more, but again, it just feels like, well, the body's a site of knowledge, but you're kind of, and even my line drawing am I gonna, I assume this gesture means this, or this facial expression means this, but actually meant something differently to them. So, yeah, challenging, but yeah, it's a good option, but I'm not 100% sold on it yet, I think.
No, I mean, what we've said here is, and that's what Ranjita was also talking about, is like finding a different way of analyzing essentially through your own embodiment and doing it that way. And I mean, the anonymization, like you say, is in itself a little bit broad as well, because on the one hand, yes, you want to make sure that people are, anonymized and protected where they need to be. But at the same time, does that mean that we're marginalizing people potentially again? Because we assume they need to be anonymized, and actually, you know what, they should have a voice and they should be able to stand for those voices as well. So it's always ethically, it's always a bit of a balancing act. I'm quite aware of the time, so I'm going to ask my question. You did have, and the one thing that I was interested in, you were talking quite early on about practice research and how, how sometimes you're just exploring things, and it's just something that develops and that you're finding out. But how do you make that knowledge that learning from it, what the things that you gain from the project, how do you make that tangible? What is it that you learn? What is the original contribution, and how do you make that, I don't know, more visible and more tangible for people?
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that is quite interesting as I'm trying to like write up in this more like formalized document where I'm like, it's not a personal reflection, but it is a learning. But I don't know if it's a contribution to knowledge learning or it's just a learning that I've had in doing the process. So I think I want to share like the workshop guide, because the kind of structuring of it towards place and kind of the way I structured some of those activities is kind of a different format that again then people can try and replicate if they're interested as well. So that kind of being a handbook that makes that accessible is something that I'm quite keen to do to make that shareable. But yeah, it's I think I'm still figuring that out about what is knowledge to me and what is knowledge to a wider community, especially when so much like innovation and theater of the oppressed is in like a practitioner landscape. So there's things that have been happening and work in the practitioner world that maybe isn't like has ever been written up in an academic journal, that type of thing. So it might be really well established knowledge over a community for years, but if it's not in an academic journal, maybe people aren't treating it as knowledge, even though it came from this practice. So yeah, definitely something to think about.
I'm going to bring Jade in, but this is the absolute last final question. Jade, come on in.
Sorry, only if there's time. Yeah, I just had some more practical ones really around how long the process took. So number of workshops, period of time, and any top tips on trying to get, because it sounds so inspiring and so exciting and like heart and sort of soul connecting. And I guess it's that piece that I'm really hoping that we can get similarities around, particularly these more marginalized group of young people that don't really have a voice anywhere and nobody's listening to them. So I was just wondering about any like top tips on that, and like if I was to pitch something like this, how long practically does it actually take?
So so I had done 3 workshops over a couple of months, but they were like recruitment for each one of them, so over like 4 months is what I've done. But you could do like, we meet once like an hour and a half every like evening, every like once a week for a month. Like that could also be a format as well. I think it can be done in quite a short amount of time actually, or it could be something that extended and develops. And then you saw in the chat as well about ethical procedures as well. I saw I think I got really lucky with my ethics process, because the reviewers that I had kind of knew what I was getting at. I really went in strong, emphasizing like preemptively about any of the critiques they had, so kind of front loaded my ethics application. But I maybe will email you after about some like more NHS specific one, because I know a couple of practitioners who are working in that context with the NHS, and maybe I can connect you with them because they'll know a bit better those specifics. So that'd be good.
Thank you very much. I'm going to very quickly share, sort of a look ahead. This is a presentation that we're going to have in May, where Lucy Gorrell-Barnes is going to be presenting on creative writing as analysis in research with children, and she calls it Putting a Light in the Window. And also there are obviously more links, and you can subscribe to the recordings on the YouTube channel, the Buzzsprout channel as a podcast. I'm also suggesting you check out the website and my contact details as well.